Thank you, Josie, for that really provocative presentation. And well, I'm Ekalan, and I'm a junior double majoring in English and art history. And I am speaking to you, first of all, from the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. And I want to honor the traditional stewards of the land and to recognize the ongoing process of colonialism. My talk, A Swamp Becomes a Wish Machine, explores the mystery of the other in Mei-mei Berssenbrugge's poetry. I will be analyzing poems from Hello the Roses, a collection of her works published by New Directions in 2013, using Levinas as an intertext. Where to begin except hello, the exclamation that one uses to acknowledge and to make oneself known to another. This instinctive declaration and innate reaction to the other precedes any act of cognition. Levinas calls this a benediction and writes that all cogito, all reflection on oneself, already presupposes a hello, and this greeting addressed to the other person, this marker of an encounter, is an invocation. Levinas insists on the primacy of the well-intentioned relation toward the other, of ethics before ontology, and of the vigilance for the other prior to the arrival of reason and consciousness. In the proximity of the other, he writes, even when there may be ill will on the other's part, the attention, the receiving of the other, like his recognition, mark the priority of good in relation to evil. And this is the priority that Mei-mei Berssenbrugge's poetry collection assumes. Hello the Roses and all of the pronouncements therein constitute an extended here I am. She offers herself with ethical sincerity. Her speech act and the exposure that it entails align with Levinas's conception of subjectivity as the disinterested vulnerability of saying. Whether the namesake of the book, Hello the Roses, is interpreted as a greeting to the roses, a reading undercut by the definite article, or a frenzied motion for the reader who has picked up the book to regard the roses, the hello foregrounds Berssenbrugge's self-offering before her addressee. Perhaps the two understandings of the title operate concurrently. As the roses call to Berssenbrugge and communicate with her through their frequencies, Berssenbrugge shares these revelations with the readers. The conflation of these two moments, Berssenbrugge's encounter with the rose and our encounter with her poetry, echo her description of her poetic practice. Berssenbrugge states that she writes as if time were simultaneous and consecutive at the same time. And consecutive at once, and even simultaneous with the future. Each moment or event projects one line, and you can move from one strand to another or pluck one strand to resonate with the one you occupy now. The folding of temporalities achieves not only a canceling out, but a confirmation and deepening of being. Like Gertrude Stein's rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose, that allows the rose to be read for the first time in English poetry for 100 years, Stein's words, Berssenbrugge's hello stretches across space and time, and in its vastness registers the preconscious nature of love for the other. In the words of Levinas, one is always nostalgic for the infinitely other, a desire for an externality already known to us, the arrival at a destination that has always awaited us patiently. Our irreducible concern for the other person is always a response to a prior need. As Berssenbrugge writes for the Poetry Society of America, I think we're born with the capacity for sensing emotional nuance around us, not only of beloved persons nearby, but of people we don't know globally, and also of animals, plants, clouds, rocks. We can perceive a kind of oversoul of the situation as a whole in present time, and also feel it radiating into the future and back to the past by walking through woods, on the desert, or in a garden. She makes evident her imbrication with her surroundings in the opening lines of Animal Voices, the first poem of the collection. I underestimate the power of my connection with other people, with animals and events that are coincident. Everyone's experienced talking with a friend when conversation suddenly deepens. Estimation supports the magic of deepening. Days begin to skew slightly, we open to accident, though touching an animal differs from feeling vibrations of its spirit or thinking it. Not only does Berssenbrugge make evident social solidarity and transhuman commonality, but she also locates the intimacy between the I and the other at a precognitive level, an accident or coincidence prior to thinking of it. This openness to contingent connections with others manifests a relationship with the world that is without a fixed frame of reference, but one wherein the self is a series of approximations reshaped through intimacies with others. The only constant that even estimations shore up is a deepening, the coming to surface of a presupposed and primordial transcendence. This first order of precognitive intimacy that comes before any linguistic representation is registered in Berssenbrugge's placement of deepens and deepening. The effect of the lines, as Edward Alexander argues in Reversible Time as Habitation, resides in how the word deepens completes a tautness of import, gradually accumulating as the representational content of the line emerges along the syntagm. But it has no other externally determined status than its selection and placement at the end of the sentence. Deepens here means and does what it says. In other words, the deepening is felt through and performed by the referent. The medium is the message. Berssenbrugge's use of deepens and deepening to slow down the lines and to allow them to come to an end stop as if sinking in contemplation and descending into primeval knowledge represents the overlap of conscious reflection and the practical contact that is its object. The reader's thoughts trail off, obeying the deepening like a command or an imperative. The cognitive and semantic content of the line conflates with the pragmatics of the utterance. The referential language that becomes an act and the tentative estimation that becomes a fait accompli reveal a transcendence that pre-exists our consciousness and already that the not yet is trying to reach. Berssenbrugge's poetry evinces the loving relationality between the I and the other. The power of her work lies not in her portrayal of the subject's autonomy, nor its Cartesian determination, but in the subject's openness to externality, the care for which is the self's priority. Her poetry attests to Levinas's statement in The Transcendence of Words that the subject who speaks does not situate the world in relation to himself. Instead, he is situated in relation to the other, autre. This privilege of the other ceases to be incomprehensible once we admit that the first fact of existence is neither being in itself, en soi, nor being for itself, pour soi, but being for the other, pour l'autre. By offering a word, the subject putting himself forward lays himself open and, in a sense, prays. The ethical emphasis of Berssenbrugge's poetry distinguishes her I from the autobiographical I of the romantics or the lyric poets who seek to assert their mind's lordship over external objects. Her I, if not already displaced by you, we, it, or another pronoun, is what Levinas calls the transcendental I, which in its nakedness comes from the awakening by and for the other. Here is a self-effacing I that is always looking out for alterity. In using Levinas as an intertext, I hope to, as Dorothy Wang does in Thinking Its Presence, distinguish Berssenbrugge from the avant-garde poets of the language and New York schools that she is often grouped with, and to recuperate a profound compassion in her work that is not reducible to object-oriented ontologists' rhapsodies to vitality. Her poems are attuned to racial and feminist stakes, the power of freedom, to borrow Levinas's words, does not congeal into impotence in Berssenbrugge's poetry. Her apparently passive and ecological poems recall Marita Bonner's On Being Young, a Woman, and Colored, in which Bonner writes, "You see clearly off there is infinity, understanding. Standing alone, waiting for someone to really want her. But she is so far out, there is no way to snatch at her and drag her in. So, being a woman, you can wait. You must sit quietly without a chip, not sodden and weighted as if your feet were cast in the iron of your soul, not wasting strength in enervating gestures as if 200 years of bonds and whips had really tricked you into nervous uncertainty. But quiet, quiet like Buddha, who, brown like I am, sat entirely at ease, entirely sure of himself, motionless and knowing, 1,000 years before the white man knew there was so very much difference between feet and hands, motionless on the outside, but inside, silent. Still, perhaps Buddha is a woman. Berssenbrugge combines Levinas's philosophy with the compassion of Guanyin, the hearer of all the cries of the world. Here is an image of a porcelain Guanyin from Berssenbrugge's own collection, sourced from an Ethics for the Erotic Avant-Garde, courtesy of Yu-Gong Kim. While retaining Levinas's emphasis on ethical relations, Berssenbrugge's poetry makes a feminist intervention, like like Gayatri Spivak's Outside in the Teaching Machine, exposes the limitation of Levinas's philosophy as a male-dominant heterosexual embrace. Berssenbrugge is not only attuned to the other, but is especially attuned homosocially to the migrant woman, the mute mother, and female materiality. She writes in Endocrinology, a collaborative book project illustrated by Kiki Smith, as if when you think about something, it already has a frame that's a priori. Think before that moment. Freedom is inside there. Hormones are molecules, material, invisible. Their flow is random, mesh through which the body is sensed, not an image. The form of her body is important, as how she is here, though there's no physical evidence of her physical suffering. These lines at once affirm Levinas's philosophy and insert into it the corporeality of women. She alludes to a responsibility for the other that precedes intellectual capture. Her use of as if performs her imperative for the readers to think before that moment, before a frame that's a priori. Her claims begin with a fundamental uncertainty, registering something essential about our personhood beyond our cognition, our care for another, and our contact with externality. However, she returns the invisible to the material. Primordial responsibility does not negate, but insists upon the body, which is tangibly sensed and not perceived as a shadowy image. Berssenbrugge states that there's no physical evidence of her physical suffering, suggesting the limitations to Levinas's understanding of alterity. His coming face to face with women precludes his knowledge of and responsibility for their embodied experiences. She reveals the seams that open at Levinas's theorizations and sutures them with her poetry. She takes responsibility for the sufferings she knows too well and which her body bears the memories of. The promise of the birth of a child that Levinas seeks to understand is practiced by women who perform the supreme form of self-offering during their carrying and nurturing of another in their body. Endocrinology is the perfect site for the understanding of a feminist ethical relationship, not only for the subject matter of Berssenbrugge's poems, but also as a result of Kiki Smith's illustrations and their collaborative spirit. I am showing you the 23rd and 24th page from the book, where Berssenbrugge's verses are accompanied by Smith's prints of fallopian tubes and ovaries. While Berssenbrugge admits to Levinas's influence in her thinking and claims that she loves the idea of opening to the question of the other, fecundity for Berssenbrugge and Smith is different from Levinas's dream of a son, as expressed in existence and existence, or time and the other. Through pregnancy, women come into tangible contact with alterity, whereas Levinas's understanding of the mother of his son will always be limited, if not entirely abstract. The woman becomes the perfect bearer of Levinas's philosophy of intersubjectivity because she lives through the dynamics of interrelation. In Berssenbrugge's 85 Notes, a selection of her deliberations on maternity, she writes that the mother is filled with many locations and identity of forces. Mothers may claim a porous and continuous relationship with the world because of their concrete and embodied experiences of pregnancy. As Sasha Steenson writes in Quo Anima, a volume about spirituality and innovation in contemporary women's poetry, edited by Jennifer Phelps and Elizabeth Robinson, the expansive nature of the mother allows for a continuum in which binaries, abstract and concrete, individual and collective, transcendent and immanent, might be reconfigured as continuous and interactive. Returning this feminine web of interrelations to Hello the Roses, I hope to close read with you the opening lines from the poem Glitter in the second part of Berssenbrugge's poem collection. It reads, "A wood violet has bloomed when I come back from my walk in early spring. I stop and welcome it, cooing, walking around it, not as if I were floating, but the surface of the world circled, unfurling petals. Person and violet with so little in common my voice reveals as a resonance of unmanifest identity. The violet, looking back, loses objectivity and enters the expansion of recognized things. You could say our identities reach out to encompass the forest environment like telepathy. A moment opens space by rendering it transparent in intensified consciousness. Others embrace weather and wildland as their means to the suprasensible. In violets, its emotional desire for spring light, glitter, the mirror. The first line describes a past event in present tense. The speaker declares her return from the walk as I make this utterance. Not only is the absence of past tense unexpected, but the reader also cannot depend on the pairing of the present tense with the future perfect. A wood violet will have bloomed when I come back from my walk in early spring. The coupling of the present with the present perfect achieves an effect of simultaneity. The violet blooms as the speaker returns from the walk, as we read this verse. This conflation of moments and kaleidoscope of subjectivities continue in the next sentence, in which Berssenbrugge writes, not as if I were floating, but the surface of the world circled, unfurling petals. The consistency of subject in a corrective statement is betrayed by the disappearance of the I and its replacement by the surface of the world. The speaker has merged with the spinning shell of the earth. The as if in the line underscores the impossibility of telling apart the speaker walking around the wood violet and the planet rotating around the plant as a fulcrum. The fusion of the speaker with the land is embedded too in the word cooing, a sound characteristic of pigeons and doves, but also babies. The verb holds transhuman potential. A bird calls to a flower like a human calls to a flower, like a mother calls to a child. Person and violet have much more in common than the speaker gives them credit for. Their proximity is detectable through the resonance between violet and voice, an entwinement that occurs on a semantic and preconscious level. However, the reader's ear is required for this intimacy to enter the plane of recognized things. Berssenbrugge implicates the reader in her web of interrelations and writes in second person, "You could say our identities reach out to encompass the forest environment like telepathy." Here, the possessive our becomes ambiguous. Does it refer to the speaker and the violet, or the speaker and the reader? Or a conglomeration of all three, the speaker as reader as violet, each one's identity and responsibility for another, extending so far as to include the entire forest. The violet's desire, and note the plurality of violets, for spring light, glitter, the mirror, is shared by the speaker and the reader. The female desire for the mirror, unlike the male desire for an alterity that reflects back to him his own image, refers to an autoerotic transcendence described by Irigaray. In Speculum of the Other Woman, Irigaray analogizes the embrace of women to the embrace of mirrors, during which, quote, both height and depth spawn and slit each other infinitely and indefinitely, and that the one is in the other, and the other in me, matters little, since it is in me that they are created in rapture, outside of all self as same. I have become your image in the nothingness that I am, and you gaze upon mine in your absence of being. A living mirror, thus am I, to your resemblance as you are mine. We are both singular and plural, one and ones, unquote. This woman-to-woman understanding of and responsibility for the other exceed Levinas's ethics. The primordial relation that conditioned their embrace reveals the silvering behind the mirror, the mystery of herself as God. Berssenbrugge brings about the infinity of the mirroring feminine other through her language. We become the reflective surface attuned to her frequencies, tuning forks that vibrate to her language, the perfect receptor for the mystery that she shall reveal to us in all her alterity and semblance. I want to leave you with a few fragments from her poem, DJ Frog, from which the namesake of my talk is sourced. In section 2 of her poem, she writes, unrelated cross rhythms refract cricket creaks and peeper croaks onto a maze of mirror surfaces. Amplification of wind and leaves expands to shimmering surface intermittence. How does music assimilating in my body induce tiny muscles at the base of my hair to contract, alter consciousness? What sounds like a million frogs is a young mother and her twin girls, flute and voices casting across rustling foliage a dimension not in time, but intensity, like light in all the dark places of inner listening. There are symbols and characters within listening. There's exchange. We grow reflective after trying to distinguish these sounds. We discern a romance in night sonorities turning to myth. A swamp becomes a wish machine, a belt of transmission between our respective dreams, a way of spatializing growing feelings of alterity surrounding us in a light of rotting vegetation in richness. Swimming through her playful alliterations and rhymes and immersing oneself in the mantric and mesmerizing hum of the M sounds, the readers come to know Berssenbrugge as the DJ, inducing muscles at the base of our hair to contract, a preconscious reaction like our ethical relation to another. Her verses not only philosophize an instinctive intersubjective responsibility, but they come into tangible contact with the readers, moving us with language that we may not understand, but cast a spell on us anyway. After all, what even is a wish machine? And why am I so convinced and enchanted by its existence as if I have known it before my birth? Berssenbrugge has written dreams into being with her words, enfolded within each syllable and each rest, is the mystery of the other that penetrates our surroundings and to which we are committed. Thank you. And at this time, I would be more than happy to take any questions that you may have. I would also love to speak to any of the images that I have chosen to accompany my slides. I didn't have enough room to include them in the talk, but they were, of course, put in a collaborative and feminist spirit like Berssenbrugge's work with Kiki Smith.